Hey everyone, welcome to session 73 of the Behavioral Observations podcast. Today's show is sponsored by HRIC. HRIC is a specialized recruiting business that's based on personalized service. So if you want to find your dream ABA job, go to hricolorado.com/contact and get in touch with Barb Voss. She's been doing this for 30 years, really knows her stuff. We'll hear more about HRIC a little bit later. This show is also sponsored by the Himalaya Podcast Player app. So just if you're frustrated with the native apps that are on your device, go to the App Store and search Himalaya, download the Himalaya Podcast Player. And while you're there, be sure to follow the Behavioral Observations podcast. My guest today is Dr. Amy Smith Wiech, and we're going to be talking about actively caring for people, particularly in the context of law enforcement. You know, there's perhaps not a more current topic than law enforcement community relationships, especially with some of the very tragic and unfortunate events that you see reported from time to time. So Amy talks to us about how she got interested in this topic, how she started applying the actively caring for people model in this, to this whole idea of policing and things like that. Along the way, we mentioned many references, charts, and things like that. Amy is very generous and supplied all those things to me, so all that stuff will be in the show notes at behavioralobservations.com. And while we're on the topic of show notes, if you want these show notes and show notes to all the episodes that get published to go directly to your email inbox, go to behavioralobservations.com and sign up for the email list. That way you won't have to miss any of them. So I think that's it for opening remarks. So without any further delay, please enjoy this fun conversation with Dr. Amy Smith Wiech.
Welcome to the Behavioral Observations Podcast, stimulating talk for today's behavior analysts. Now here's your host, Matt Sikoria.
Dr. Amy Smith Wiech, thanks for joining me today on the Behavioral Observations Podcast. How are things out in sunny Hawaii? Or what I hope is sunny Hawaii.
Great, things are great. Things are sunny, lots of rainbows. The surf is big right now, so a lot of action in the ocean. So thanks for having me on the Behavioral Podcast.
The pleasure's mine. So we're recording this on January 15th, and I think yesterday it was something like -7 when I was driving to work. So this is I guess what's the word I'm looking for? Vicariously living through perhaps the nice weather that's out there. What's so the surf is great. What's the temperature out there these days? What is it like in January in Hawaii? Just out of curiosity.
In January we get temperatures that can dip into the 50s. Upper 50s, which we get very excited about. And I see that you're laughing. But we just want every opportunity to wear that fleece or, our down jacket, at 50 degrees in the morning. But then it gets up to 80s. So, yeah.
The one fleece people have in their closet or something like that.
Right. You should see the girls here. They wear their Ugg boots to work, and it's just hilarious and pants and shirts and sweaters and yeah.
And then flip-flops by the end of the day, I guess.
Yeah, after things warm up a little bit.
Oh my gosh, that's funny. So when it's 59 degrees here in New Hampshire, people are like out in shorts and t-shirts and things like that, especially in the springtime. But so all the listeners in the Northeast and the Midwest and Upper Midwest right now are probably like, would probably love to have the chance to hang out in the upper 50s. But we are as much as we can continue on about the nice weather out there. I want to hear about some of the work that you've been doing over the last couple of years with the actively caring for people stuff. We're going to get into what that is for those who aren't familiar with it. But first, I'd like to hear about how you first got into behavior analysis. So if you can give us a little bit of background about how you discovered ABA and how you decided that it was for you as a career and everything like that, that would be a great place to start.
Cool. So I kind of got into ABA when I was in high school. I got into autism, I should say. I started volunteering with a man who had a developmental disability, who was working for my father and who lived at the institution across the road. And I found that and kind of drifted away, and then found my way back to behavior analysis because I had gotten into special education, and I had been lucky enough to take a course called behavior modification. And it kind of, that was probably the point at which I kind of, discovered the science of behavior and how it could lend itself to what I was on my way to do, which was teach special education. That didn't last long because I kept coming back to behavior analysis, and I had been a LOVAS therapist in college. And so then I just kind of kept going down that path, and I founded a clinic for kids with autism in 2006. And I guess, 13 years later, here we are. And we have probably at least 50 staff and over 10,000 square feet, and just chugging along. So, yeah.
I see. Now, was all this in Hawaii, or did you migrate out there at some point?
I did. I migrated out here after college, after my bachelor's degree. And so, yes, all of this transpired here on the island of Oahu.
I see. And what is the name of your company?
It's called Autism Behavior Consulting Group, which we fondly refer to as ABC Group.
I see. Well, I guess that certainly fits the behavioral motif for sure.
Okay.
So as much as we can get into what it's like to run a clinic and what it's like to practice in Hawaii and things like that, we kind of started this conversation, or at least I got interested in talking to you because I started noticing. I started seeing some posts on social media, in particular. I think it was Instagram, if I'm not mistaken, where I think you were. Had these neat little pictures of little police cars and things like that, and then I think there were some conferences that you had gone to where you were interacting with law enforcement personnel, and I always gravitate towards applications of our science that are perhaps outside of what we typically do on a day-to-day basis, in the support and treatment of individuals with developmental disabilities. And so I saw that, I'm like, that's different. I want to learn more about that. And so one of the fun things about having this show is being able to call people up like yourself and say, hey, let's dig into that a little bit more. So I came to learn that you were involved with the actively caring for people, and it's particularly its application to law enforcement and things like that. And I'm realizing that some of our listeners perhaps aren't familiar with what the general idea of actively caring for people is in the first place. So I was wondering if you can take a minute and talk about what that is, and then we can kind of get into what that means as it relates to its application to policing and law enforcement, et cetera.
Okay, perfect. So I was actually kind of involved in law enforcement a little bit prior to finding out about actively caring for people policing. But I had gone to an ABAI work symposium like you did, and I had stumbled upon Scott Geller and the work that he had been doing. So this process comes out of a process that was developed at Virginia Tech, I want to say in 1996. I don't really know the exact date off the top of my head, but it came about after the Virginia Tech shootings occurred. And I believe some of his students and him came together, to kind of think about ways to use behavioral science to not only change their campus, but to change the world. And what they discovered is that after that shooting, people were very isolated, and it was pretty obvious that the sense of community, needed some repair. So they developed a process to basically catch others being good or doing the right thing or going above and beyond, and then to call them out for that behavior, which, is not instinctive of most citizens in our country, except for us behavior analysts, of course.
Right. It's easy to tell someone to knock it off. It's harder to pay enough attention to realize when someone is doing something you want to see more of and take the opportunity to comment on it.
Right. So that's kind of where this process came from. And then I had been, I think it was 2015 in about April, I believe. It was right around when the Freddie Gray story was, on Fox News and on CNN, and I'm sort of from Baltimore, from Maryland, that area. And I remember watching that on TV and just thinking, like, what is going on? And, thinking to myself, the media is purporting this percentage of increases in deaths by officers, and people are just killing, or police are just killing people left and right. And so I kind of was wanting to know where they were getting that information from, and I ended up attending ABAI that year, and I remember having conversations with other behavior analysts, and I'm pretty sure someone had quoted Skinner on that one. I think the Skinner quote goes something like, if you find something interesting, dig into it more, explore it more. And so I did. And I started to look for any sources of data that they were basing the media reports on. And I quickly learned that there wasn't any, and that our government, the FBI, the Department of Justice, had never set up a data collection system to track that. They did have a system in place, but it wasn't required, it wasn't mandated that law enforcement agencies produce that and give that data to the Department of Justice.
You mean data on officer-involved shootings?
Yeah. Mm-hmm. And a lot of the data, any data that you would be reporting from a police agency wasn't required to be reported to the federal government. And only about 20%, if that, of agencies were reporting that kind of data. And those agencies that were reporting it were like, the really small agencies with like 10 people, where they might not even have had any officer involved shootings or anything like that occur. So I ended up finding a couple of data sets that were based on corporate news reports. And so I ended up taking that and presenting the limitations with those data sets. And then I charted those, and I just wanted to see what the picture looked like. So I charted them on standard acceleration charts, and sat at the bar at ABAI in 2015 and kind of did some bar napkin research while I was sitting there. And
that sounds like a classic ABAI activity for sure.
Yeah, exactly. And then I had a couple of other behavior analysts and look at the charts and kind of help me start thinking about them. And Abigail Calkin was one of those people, and she really kind of was one of the ones to spur me on this path as well. And it was interesting, looking at the acceleration at that time in terms of the limitations of the data were there. But, the acceleration wasn't what the media was reporting. So there was definitely a gap in a disparity between those two. So
was it higher or lower? What was the nature of the disparity?
I want to say, I don't have that in front of me at the time. It was,
but just ballpark. What was the media saying, that the shootings were higher than what you had plotted on the chart?
Yeah, the media was purporting it to be much higher in occurrence than what was being recorded, what I had reported on the charts. So the disparity was there. I want to say it was like maybe a 15%. If you're going to convert the acceleration into a percentage, maybe 15% increase. But, they didn't, that was very incomplete data as well. And then I just continued to update the data. And once the sources had completed their data, I ended up representing it this past year at ABAI again. I presented it, I think, in 2016, and then I just presented it again in 2018, kind of in an attempt to begin to talk about it and to begin to talk about the work that that needs to be done in this area.
Do you have any of those charts still hanging around by chance?
Yeah.
All right. So if you wouldn't mind, would you want to if you can send one to me, I can put it in the show notes, because I'm sure people driving around their cars and walking their dogs and things like that, if they get a chance to check that out, anytime you start talking about graphing data and things like that to this crowd, they're going to want to go take a look at it. So we'll have those in the show notes. So folks, if you're listening, just go to behavioralobservations.com and look for this particular episode, and we'll have that information there. So anyway, so my extremely curious interruption notwithstanding, so what was the response from you presented twice at ABAI, and what kind of response were you getting from the attendees?
Well, I think in 2016, I presented with Kent Corso and Jim Mader. Those are two other behavior analysts, or one behavior analyst and one behavior analyst in the making, that have interest in law enforcement as well. And I remember at that time we had this wild idea that we should invite, and I think at that time it was in Chicago, and we had this wild idea that we should invite the Chicago Police Department to come to our presentation. Not a good idea. Not a good idea at that time, anyway, because there was a lot of controversy and, corruption, and there was, a lot of people were being killed by police in Chicago in 2016. So, not a good time to walk into the Chicago Police Department and show them what you had done and ask them to come to your presentation. They just thought it was going to be a cop bashing session, when in fact it really is not. It is really not. And I tried my best to convince them that I was a behavioral scientist and that I'm here to help them. And I want to share with the world that this crisis is a crisis, but it's not to the degree that the media is making it out to be. But I didn't get a warm reception. They thought that I was a reporter, and I had to go back and forth with, do I look like a reporter? I guess I do. I don't really know. So that didn't go over very well.
Oh my gosh. They think you were doing kind of like a Geraldo Rivera thing where you're, kind of pretending to be, some sort of hidden camera situation. Oh, goodness.
They were very, very on edge, and I didn't get very far with them at all. And I handed out a bunch of flyers about the symposium and what we were going to be presenting. And just the whole reception was just, very punishing.
Are you looking for a new job, but you're overwhelmed with all the emails that you're getting from various ABA agencies? What if there was someone who was in your corner and could help you find the perfect job placement? Well, that person exists. Barbara Voss has been working as a recruiter for over 30 years, and her company, HRIC, specializes in placing BCBAs in permanent full-time positions throughout the United States. Barbara has been placing BCBAs since 2011, so she knows our business, and she offers personalized service to any BCBA looking for a new position. She also helps companies looking to hire BCBAs too. Here are just some of the things Barbara can help you with. She can provide information about salary ranges in different markets across the country. She can help you write your resume. She can coordinate and prepare you for the interview process, and even help negotiate the right salary for you. And best of all, There are no charges to any candidate for all of these services. When you are ready to make a change and want to work with someone who will listen to you and understand what you need in a new position, contact Barbara at HRIC. To schedule a confidential discussion, head over to hricolorado.com. Again, that's hricolorado.com, and hit the contact button to connect with Barbara. You won't be disappointed. So if that was in 2016, it sounds like that didn't slow you down though, because you it sounds like you kept on kind of working at it. And so how did you kind of proceed from this? So you couldn't get the Chicago cops to come, but I'm assuming you had other folks in attendance, of course, because especially given the I suppose I'm just kind of thinking back a couple of years that was probably the time where this issue was, very front and center on people's minds. So in terms of the response from, the garden variety behavior analysts attending, how did people respond to the information that you presented?
I mean, everybody was very, interested in the topic. And I kind of remember even at that time, there was people interested in how they could get involved. And, I didn't really have an answer at that time. Just go throw yourself, just go walk into a police department like I did. And hopefully you get a warmer reception than I did. But, then it kind of made me think, I skipped a year and then I came back last year and presented again and kind of added more a dissemination approach to the presentation, because I had been, working, a little bit on the AC4P policing process and being on board with the nonprofit, the National Center for the Prevention of Community Violence, which Actively Caring for People Policing is a part of. I'm on that board as well. And so I just kind of, the target and the aim was a bit more dissemination approach and in 2018. And, I kind of told a story, I think, at that symposium, and kind of told the story of how I kind of got involved and then where I saw the critical needs in that field that behavior analysis could assist with, and kind of started to, incite, to all the behavior analysts in the audience to generate ways to get involved. And, pairing is one of the ways that behavior analysts can get involved, is just, going to your local police department, introducing yourself. Don't call yourself a behavior analyst. They won't like that. They'll think that you work at Quantico in, the behavior analysis there. So their verbiage and their semantics is a lot different than ours. So that's really something to be aware of when you're speaking with people in the law enforcement field.
Yeah. I wanted to get into that because certainly, we talk about cultural competencies in various ways in our field, and I have to imagine that in law enforcement, that has its own kind of not that we want to assume that every single law enforcement officer kind of thinks the same, of course, but there's, we use the term culture, I guess, for a reason. And so you mentioned a couple of things in terms of, what not to call yourself and things like that. But are there other things that you learned when trying to develop relationships with these agencies that would be helpful for listeners to know about if they want to also kind of take up this mantle?
Yeah, I mean, it's definitely a different culture. In the same way, the culture that you come from is different, or the culture from someone coming from another country is different. Their beliefs and their values and their traditions are, much different than yours and mine. I mean, I kind of sort of immersed myself, or tried to immerse myself into that culture as best I could, making friends with, police officers that were in the field and just, going on ride-alongs and, sitting down to eat with them at a restaurant and realizing and learning that they can't have their backs to the door. I never thought about that. But that's just something that all police officers, if you ask any of them, they will sit there and they will do an observational analysis of the dining room if they're going to a restaurant or if they're in any public setting, and they will find a table. They will not agree to go sit at a table where their back cannot be at the door, facing the door. So that was very surprising to me.
The situational awareness, I think sometimes that's referred to.
Situational awareness, and I pride myself with, I'm sure all behavior analysts are like this. I just observe people, and I love watching people, and I'm catching things that people are doing that nobody else is catching, and it's kind of similar to police officers, but they are very vigilant, and that state of heightened vigilance and arousal, so to speak, never wanes. That's one of the kind of another crisis within their field is the physical and mental health issues that exist with police officers who have had to deal with that level of trauma and that level of stress and that level of heightened awareness and that level of arousal that is pretty standard with most police officers.
Yeah, I have to imagine if that is going kind of nonstop, that's just from a fatigue standpoint, that's got to be exhausting.
Yeah, it's it makes you think. I've done a lot of reading on the topic and have learned a lot about family members and how family members are affected by that stress and just that the mental health issues that go along with it, which again in their culture no one's allowed to admit that they have an issue. So and then you're getting into like the issue of suicide within the law enforcement community. People don't talk about that and those rates. So those are something else that I'm interested in looking at, the acceleration of, police officer deaths by suicide, but in the future.
Is that something you haven't charted yet?
No, I haven't charted that yet.
Okay.
I'm trying to find that data set, and apparently a reliable data set for that as well is hard to produce because of the reporting issues within agencies. A lot of agencies won't want to report it as that.
I see. So someone might get into like a car crash or something like that, or I'm using air quotes here, an accident, or something, and then when in reality it could be something that's more self-imposed than anything else.
Right. Or they'll report the line of duty deaths, but they won't report an officer, taking his own life when he's not on duty at home, that kind of thing. So.
I see. Wow, what a tough subject to tackle, but important nonetheless. All right, so we talked about in terms of ways behavior analysts can kind of make some inroads. Don't call yourself a behavior analyst. What do you call yourself? As I suppose. What is it? What is a good way to kind of make an introduction?
I think Scott Geller corrected me the one time when I was using the term in addressing law enforcement. He was the one who said it. Don't call yourself a behavior analyst. Call yourself a behavioral scientist. So I think from that day forward, for everything that I do, it's just easier to call myself a behavioral scientist because it's just a lot easier to swallow. And then especially within law enforcement, they don't confuse you with being someone who works at Quantico in the behavior analysis unit. So
I see. So as it relates to I know we kind of went over the basics of actively caring for people just more generally, right? And what? So how does this work with the policing angle? So what does that look like? And what are some things that you've seen that have been done? Fill us in a little bit about how that works.
Okay, great. So I think it was a couple of years ago. Scott Geller and Bobby Kipper published a book called Actively Caring for People Policing. We could probably put that up on the website as well.
I got it. Yeah.
So it kind of goes through the whole process. It's kind of meant to be more of a training manual for police officers. The whole premise around actively caring for people policing, it's basically like a community policing process that teaches officers to use, feedback and feed forward, and teaches them how to look at motivation and observational learning and basically just use pairing. I think the whole process of actively caring for people policing is pairing. So the whole process is basically like, imagine this: you're sitting on a city bus, and it's a crowded bus, and you see this 19-year-old kid get up and offer his seat to an elderly lady, right? And he sits down, and you're a police officer, right? Do you just stand there and watch it happen, or do you go up to the guy afterwards sometime and just be like, "Hey man, I saw what you did. That was really cool."
Mm-hmm.
Most police officers are not going to do that, but if the whole actively caring for people policing is basically calling out for people for their good behavior like that, and reinforcing that and giving them some kudos for that behavior. And within actively caring for people policing, there's, excuse me while I reach down here and grab a handy dandy bracelet. There's blue bracelets for police officers that each have a number on them that can be recorded in terms of recording the number in that interaction currently right now on a website, but I know that we're working on getting it into an app version so that perhaps a Q code could be scanned or something like that. And then we would just have a whole abundance of data that we don't have already on this. But so the officer would hand that 20-year-old kid a bracelet and say, "Hey man, this is actively caring for people policing. I just want to highlight, that you just gave up your seat for that woman. Great job. Your mom's probably pretty proud of you," or whatever you say. Here's an actively caring for people policing bracelet. The goal would be to go to the website and put the number in, and then kind of write a little synopsis about that interaction. And hopefully, it's a positive interaction. And the more positive interactions people have with police, I think that, there's your pairing right there, and changing the way that people their outlook towards police and their attitudes and their perceptions. That's kind of the outcome of the whole AC4P policing process.
So instead of a policeman being some aversive stimulus, someone coming towards you, you see, whenever I see a cruiser when I'm on the highway, I always, think, oh, I should slow down, your heart kind of gets going a little bit and things like that. So this would be kind of countering that by increasing the likelihood of positive interactions with law enforcement personnel. Is that basically the gist of it?
Yeah, that's basically the gist of it. So, it's kind of like double-sided. It's great for citizens. It's a way to repair the citizen police relationship problem that we have in this country, and just teach officers to kind of go back to the true definition of what community policing should be. Community policing has kind of gotten away of what the definition is. You'll see officers in their cars on their computers or on their computers or on their phones, right? That's not what community policing is, right? Community policing is getting out, meeting the people in that community, talking to them, catching them being good, doing good things. The more an officer is able to develop that kind of a relationship within a community, there's also benefits for that officer. They're going to have people that trust them. They're going to have people that trust them to give them information that they might not be able to obtain otherwise. So there's a whole list of benefits from both sides that are produced by this process.
Yeah, it kind of reminds me of the old time kind of notion of a police officer walking the beat, if you will, and getting out and interacting with folks in a neighborhood or something like that.
It's like bringing back Andy Griffith.
That's right. What has been? So I can imagine that there's probably some proportion of folks when they see, we're predisposed as behavior analysts, obviously, to think about this. I'm like, well, this sounds great. Of course, let's more of this, please. And I have to imagine on the other hand, however, there might be some resistance in terms of this approach. Have you seen that?
No.
Really?
Actually,
I'm so because here's what's going on. I guess in my head, if I would have this probably, if I walked into like the I don't know, the largest police department we have here in my state's probably the city of Manchester Police Department. And if I walked in there, hey, my name's Matt, I'm a behavior scientist, I'm here to help you. I would, of course I wouldn't do it like that, but I'm just, I'm taking it to a ridiculous extreme, but it's kind of like, I do a lot of school consultation, and I try not to do the same thing. Like, hey, I listen, even though I've never been a teacher, I know all this stuff and I can help you. If you come at it from that angle, at least my experience has been, you're not going to be super successful. So I'm just trying to think, and I know we already kind of covered how to make an introduction and things like that, but I'm surprised, I guess, that you haven't had pushback in terms of like, well, I've been doing this for 25 years, and I know what good policing is, and what do you know, Mr. Smarty Pants or something like that. So am I just making this up in my head, or is this?
No, I think you're gonna come across officers that are cynical. Okay, there's officers that are just, they've been in this field for 20, 25 years, and they know their culture, and and they're going to be the real cynical ones, where they're not going to see the big picture of this whole process and the behavior changing outcomes that it could have if we are able to disseminate this in a much more widespread way. But there's a whole list of things that are critical needs within the field of law enforcement right now, and community policing is one of them. And bringing it back is one of the, 21st century policing. Obama released this report, and there was this whole task force, and it was one of the pillars. There was I think 6 pillars of recommendations for law enforcement agencies across the country, given the crisis that we're in. And so this kind of just is one of is the solution, I think, because it's based in science. It's based on behavioral science. We have a mechanism, a pretty premature mechanism for collecting data on behavior change. I think that there have been, I believe, about maybe 15 agencies that have been trained in this process. It's not I feel like I'm nobody when it comes to law enforcement. I'm like, they're like, so, I go to the national conferences. So what agency do you work for? And then I'm like, well, I'm a behavioral scientist. And they're like, wow, really cool. So what do you do? And it just opens the door for talking about this and talking about behavioral science. And I wouldn't recommend to a behavior analyst to go into this alone. Find a friend who is already a law enforcement agent or officer and make friends with them and go sit down and have a beer with them every week and kind of like talk to them about what is the science? What are these principles of our science that could lend themselves to doing some good in another field other than autism? That's kind of why I have been kind of segueing into this field. Yeah.
I see.
Was that a good question?
Yeah, I think so. Yeah, that's okay. No, well, it's one of the questions I was going to ask, I guess is kind of related to this in terms of, I was going to ask, what sort of outcomes have been seen from this approach. But I think the challenge is that, given the some of the problems with the types of data that are available, from an experimental design standpoint, it's probably a nightmare in terms of trying to do any well-controlled study on the the efficacy of something like this.
If we did it, in a like a single subject design sort of way, I think there's potential there. It's not been done yet. I think that, one of the other benefits that I see in terms of this process is, you always see these videos on YouTube, the police officer who pulls over someone and hands them an ice cream cone or something like that. Or, they pull them over and the person's like sweating bullets. And then all of a sudden the officers are like, here, we'd like to give you this turkey. And the person's like having a heart attack because they think that they're getting pulled over for something else. But, they want to do those sort of like media worthy types of posts to help them get in the good graces with the community. But, I kind of have a problem with the way that they're doing them, and I think that this is more along the path of, a way to catch people being good and reinforce behavior rather than just give out ice cream cones. And, there's value to that too. But again, that's a whole nother can of worms and rabbit hole that we're going down because, in most situations, I would go out on a limb to say that there's no data being collected in those types of initiatives, tactics, and programs either. So, and a lot of times they don't necessarily, and this is in my humble experience, they don't necessarily know the reasons that they're doing these programs. It seems to be that, well, and I don't want to sound cynical either, but the chief in the next town over is doing it, so we're going to do that program, and the aim might not be as clear, like in terms of setting up a research design in order to test a hypothesis and to determine whether that intervention was effective in changing community or citizen behavior. You have these are laboratories all over the United States, all over the world. Each police agency is a laboratory. So it gets me excited, but yet it's just like, how do you reach all those agencies? Well, we have behavior analysts all over the country. So there's got to be a way to, let's work together in doing something that's going to improve, one set of behaviors, but in a more widespread manner.
I see. Where are these wristbands being given out right now in the biggest density, if you will? Where in other words, what communities are really doing this and doing this with some level of intensity or what have you?
So most of the agencies are in Florida. I think like Winter Park. I'm not sure of some of the other names of these agencies. There's a couple in Arizona. There's a couple in Illinois. You can go to the Actively Caring for People Policing website and find a list of the agencies that have been trained in this process. Yeah.
Yeah, it'd be interesting to see if there's any inroads being made, particularly in those communities that have come to light, in this, in some of these really tragic events. I'm thinking of, Baltimore, New York City, I'm thinking large metropolitan areas.
Yeah. I went to Baltimore to talk to the commissioner a couple of years ago because he was a friend of mine, and but he's no longer there. So one city at a time. But yeah, I think one of the other challenges that we've had with Actively Caring for People Policing is the funding. We grant funding and things like that, and just kind of organizationally. Bringing people on board who understand behavior, right? And who have that same shared goal and those same shared values in place. So
I see. I'm ashamed to say I forgot to look this up before we got online here, but is there a SIG? Is there an ABAI SIG for this general area?
There is. I think, though, it's called Military and Veterans. The Military and Veterans SIG. So what I've been doing is kind of been under that SIG. I do believe, so John O'Neill is another behavior analyst who I believe works out of I want to say Minnesota or somewhere like that. Somewhere where you brew your own beer, because I've seen him brewing beer a lot.
I like this guy already. I wouldn't recognize him from Adam, but he sounds like a good guy.
But he's been doing a lot of work with police training academies, so for cadets. And he's been presenting at ABAI, and he's also been presenting at the International Association for Chiefs of Police conference. And that's another thing I'd recommend, just immersing yourself in other conferences outside of our conferences. But John he's been working on evaluating training procedures that are used for training officers, mostly disarming. I'm not familiar with the kind of stuff he's doing, but disarming someone. If someone has a gun, there's certain a procedure or protocol that they teach that would effectively and safely disarm someone if they have a gun. So things like that is what he has been working with academies on, and using behavioral skills training to better train their officers.
Wow, that sounds like work that certainly needs to be done for sure. And again, it just kind of yet another example of how we can kind of stretch our horizons, if you will, or across a variety of areas of intervention beyond what we're doing right now. So, as a field, that is.
Yep. Yeah, I think he's. Is it called the Association for Contextual Science, or is it? Can't remember the name of it.
Oh yeah, ACBS, the Association for Contextual Behavioral Science. Yeah.
Yeah, I think he's associated with that as well too, or maybe it's something similar to that. But
all right, well we'll run the details of that down and have that in the show notes as well. So, yeah, that sounds like a really interesting area of intervention. So we're looking at this being applied pretty heavily in certain pockets of the country, and but obviously not widespread. What you mentioned funding as a barrier. Are there other barriers to perhaps getting this out there that you can think of?
I mean, there's a couple of administrative things that we can improve, and organizational improvements, things like that. I just think, just having more hands on board and, understanding the greater vision and the, the impact that this simple process could have on millions and millions of people in the world. I think that's that's exciting to me. Because, to us, catching people being good is just an easy thing, right? We do it all the time. We have, one of those boards, a whiteboard in the back where we just call out people's behavior. Thank you to Matt for offering to assist when, blah, 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 blah. So, those things don't come automatically to law enforcement agents. They definitely are historically coercive in their interactions and the way that they handle situations. So they don't necessarily understand that positive reinforcement is much more effective than punishment, as evidenced by, the tickets and things like that. So
for sure. We're coming up on a little bit of a time boundary here, so I just want to make sure we get everything in that we want to. Is there anything else about this line of work that you want to mention before we hop off here?
No, I think there's a lot of things that we can contribute to in the field of law enforcement. I think if people are interested in getting involved, don't hesitate to reach out to me. I would be glad to, partner with them, work alongside with them in any capacity that I have. And I think just, getting involved locally with their law enforcement agencies, even if it's just to offer free training on autism or free training, Autism 101 or whatever it is, pairing is the first step. And, going there with some donuts and coffee and just start slow. It's a shaping process too.
All right, great. All right. Well, we have to kind of close the show here. So let's end with, as I always like to do, asking you for any advice for a newly minted BCBA, whether it has to do with this topic or something completely different.
Oh, wow. I mean, I wish I had kind of known about this as a newly minted BCBA. I think, I don't know. I think there's so many opportunities available in the field of law enforcement, but they're not really readily available. Does that make sense? I think you have to carve out your own, area of expertise, and that's going to take a lot of time on the job, even if it's if it's doing it for love, because I basically do this for love. So yeah, just the commitment to it. And if it's a passion, then just follow the passion and they'll find new areas to explore within all of the solutions that need to be solved in the world and using behavior analysis.
Great. All right, Amy, thanks so much for joining me today.
Thanks so much, Matt.
All right, bye-bye.
Stay warm.
Yeah, I'll do my best.
Thank you for listening to the Behavioral Observations Podcast with Matt Sikoria. You can find Matt's notes on this episode at www.behavioralobservations.com. We also invite you to stay connected with us on Facebook at facebook.com/behavioral observations and on Twitter at Behavior Podcast.